It was just another Friday night shift for Deborah. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of customers, the faint hum of the old jukebox in the corner. It was all part of the rhythm she'd grown used to. But tonight, the rhythm was about to break. A man in a tailored suit walked in, his presence commanding the room. Leonard Grayson, wealthy, arrogant, and used to getting his way. He didn't just sit down, he took over. And when his eyes landed on Deborah, something shifted. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "I hear you can sing." The room fell silent. Deborah froze, her hands clutching the tray she was holding. She could feel the weight of every stare, every judgment. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a trap. But then, something inside her stirred. A spark she thought had died long ago. She set the tray down, walked to the piano in the corner, and placed her fingers on the keys. What happened next? No one could have predicted. The air in the restaurant was thick with the scent of fried food and stale perfume. Deborah moved through the chaos like a ghost, her feet aching, her hands raw from scrubbing dishes. She hated Fridays. The crowd was louder, the tips were smaller, and the exhaustion always hit harder. She glanced at the clock, 10:47 p.m. Just another hour to go. That's when he walked in. Leonard Grayson. Even if she hadn't recognized him from the papers, his presence would have been impossible to ignore. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his demeanor screamed power. He didn't wait to be seated. He chose the best table in the house, the one by the window, and ordered a whiskey without even looking at the menu. Deborah felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd heard stories about him, how he'd built his fortune on the backs of others, how he thrived on humiliation, but she never thought she'd have to serve him. She took a deep breath and approached the table. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything else?" He looked up, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're Deborah, right?" She nodded, unsure where this was going. "I heard you used to sing. Back in the day." Her heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? It had been years since she'd performed. Years since she'd even touched a piano. She forced a smile. "That was a long time ago, sir." He leaned back, swirling his whiskey. "Prove it." The room seemed to shrink. Every eye was on her, every ear waiting for her response. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. But then, something inside her snapped. She set the tray down on a nearby table and walked to the piano in the corner. It was old and out of tune, but it was still a piano. She ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar grooves and imperfections. The first note was soft, hesitant, but then came the second and the third, until the melody filled the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw, real, and undeniably powerful. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even Leonard Grayson looked stunned. But this was only the beginning. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. Deborah wiped her hands on her apron, stealing a glance at the grand piano tucked into the corner. It had been years since she touched one, but the longing never faded. She sighed, returning to the present. Tonight was just another shift, or so she thought. Deborah's life was a series of routines, each day blending into the next. She woke up at 5 a.m., the sound of her alarm clock cutting through the silence of her small apartment. The walls were thin, and she could hear the muffled sounds of her neighbors, a crying baby, a couple arguing, the faint hum of a TV. She didn't mind. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone, even if it felt that way most of the time. She made her way to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under her feet. The coffee pot was already set up from the night before. She pressed the button and waited, staring out the window at the city waking up. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the rooftops. By 6 a.m., she was out the door, her bag slung over her shoulder. The bus stop was a block away, and she always made sure to get there early. The bus was never on time, but she couldn't afford to be late. Not again. The diner where she worked was called Maggie's Place, a small, family-owned restaurant that had been around for decades. It wasn't much to look at. The paint was peeling, the sign was faded, and the furniture was worn, but it had character. And more importantly, it had regulars, people who came in every day, sat in the same seats, and ordered the same things. They were like family in a way. Deborah's shift started at 7 a.m. She greeted the cook, a gruff man named Frank, and the other waitress, a bubbly college student named Tina. They exchanged a few words, but mostly they worked in silence. The morning rush was always busy, and there wasn't much time for conversation. By 10 a.m., the rush had died down, and Deborah finally had a moment to breathe. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the counter, watching the world go by outside the window. The diner was located on a busy street, and there was always something to see. People rushing to work, kids walking to school, the occasional street performer. It was during one of these quiet moments that Deborah's thoughts would drift to the past. She hadn't always been a waitress. Once she had been a singer, a good one. She had performed in clubs, recorded demos, even had a manager at one point. But life had other plans. A broken contract, a series of bad decisions, and before she knew it, her dreams were gone. She still loved music, though. It was the one thing that kept her going. Sometimes, when the diner was empty, she would sit at the old piano in the corner and play. It was out of tune and missing a few keys, but it was enough. The piano had been there for as long as Deborah could remember. It was a relic from the diner's heyday, when it had been a popular spot for live music. Now, it was mostly ignored, a piece of furniture that no one paid much attention to. But to Deborah, it was a lifeline. Her favorite time to play was late at night, after the dinner rush was over and the diner was quiet. She would sit at the piano and let her fingers wander, playing whatever came to mind. Sometimes it was a song she had written years ago. Other times, it was something new, a melody that had been stuck in her head all day. Those moments were rare, though. Most of the time, she was too tired to play, too tired to do anything but go home, collapse into bed, and do it all over again the next day. But tonight was different. It started like any other Friday night. The diner was busy, the tables full of people laughing and talking. Deborah moved through the chaos with practiced ease, taking orders, refilling drinks, and clearing plates. She was good at her job, even if it wasn't what she had imagined for herself. Then he walked in. Leonard Grayson. Even if she hadn't recognized him from the papers, his presence would have been impossible to ignore. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his demeanor screamed power. He didn't wait to be seated. He chose the best table in the house, the one by the window, and ordered a whiskey without even looking at the menu. Deborah felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd heard stories about him, how he'd built his fortune on the backs of others, how he thrived on humiliation. But she never thought she'd have to serve him. She took a deep breath and approached the table. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you anything else?" He looked up, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're Deborah, right?" She nodded, unsure where this was going. "I heard you used to sing. Back in the day." Her heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? It had been years since she'd performed, years since she'd even touched a piano. She forced a smile. "That was a long time ago, sir." He leaned back, swirling his whiskey. "Prove it." The room seemed to shrink. Every eye was on her, every ear waiting for her response. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. But then, something inside her snapped. She set the tray down on a nearby table and walked to the piano in the corner. It was old and out of tune, but it was still a piano. She ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar grooves and imperfections. The first note was soft, hesitant, but then came the second and the third, until the melody filled the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw, real, and undeniably powerful. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even Leonard Grayson looked stunned. But this was only the beginning. Leonard Grayson leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey as he smirked. "You say you know music." His voice carried across the restaurant. "Prove it." Deborah froze, her hands trembling. The room grew quieter as every eye turned toward her. He was daring her, no, setting her up to fail. And she knew it. The silence in the diner was deafening. Deborah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Leonard Grayson's words echoed in her mind, each one a sharp reminder of how far she had fallen. She hadn't performed in years, hadn't even touched a piano in months. And now, here she was, being challenged in front of a room full of strangers. She glanced around, taking in the faces of the customers. Some looked curious, others amused, but most were just waiting to see what would happen. She could feel their eyes on her, their expectations pressing down on her like a weight. Deborah took a deep breath and walked to the piano in the corner. It was old and out of tune, but it was still a piano. She ran her fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar grooves and imperfections. The first note was soft, hesitant, but then came the second and the third, until the melody filled the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw, real, and undeniably powerful. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Even Leonard Grayson looked stunned. But the moment didn't last. As the applause died down, Leonard stood up, his smirk returning. "Not bad," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But let's see if you can handle the big leagues." Deborah frowned, unsure what he meant. Before she could ask, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's me. I've found her. Bring the contract." Her heart sank. A contract? What was he talking about? Leonard hung up and turned to her. "You've got talent, Deborah, but talent alone isn't enough. You need someone like me to make you a star." She shook her head, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I don't understand. What are you saying?" He leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "I'm saying I can make you famous, but it's going to cost you." Deborah's mind raced. She had heard stories about Leonard Grayson, how he had built his fortune on the backs of others, how he thrived on control and manipulation. She knew better than to trust him, but the offer was tempting. Before she could respond, a man in a suit walked in, carrying a briefcase. He set it down on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of papers. Leonard gestured for Deborah to sit. "Take a look," he said, sliding the contract toward her. She hesitated, then sat down and began to read. The terms were overwhelming: exclusive rights to her music, a percentage of her earnings, and a clause that gave him control over her career. It was a trap, and she knew it. But the promise of fame, of finally achieving her dreams, was hard to resist. She looked up at Leonard, her mind racing. "I need time to think about this." He smirked. "Time is a luxury you don't have, Deborah. This offer is only good tonight." The pressure was unbearable. She glanced around the room, searching for some kind of support, but the faces were blank, indifferent. She was on her own. Finally, she took a deep breath and stood up. "I'm sorry, but I can't sign this." Leonard's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "You're making a mistake, Deborah. A big one." She shook her head, her resolve hardening. "No, I'm not. I won't let you control me." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that." With that, he stood up and walked out, leaving Deborah standing there, the contract still on the table. She felt a mix of relief and fear, unsure of what she had just done. But she knew one thing for sure: Leonard Grayson wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The next few days were a blur. Deborah tried to go back to her normal routine, but the encounter with Leonard lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big. Her fears were confirmed when she arrived at the diner one morning to find a crowd gathered outside. They were reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers, all waiting for her. "Deborah, over here!" One of the reporters shouted, shoving a microphone in her face. "Is it true you turned down Leonard Grayson?" She froze, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, another reporter chimed in. "What's next for you, Deborah? Are you planning to make a comeback?" The questions came fast and furious, overwhelming her. She pushed through the crowd and into the diner, where Frank and Tina were waiting. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. Frank handed her a newspaper. The headline read, "Local waitress turns down $1 million deal." Deborah's heart sank. She scanned the article, her stomach churning. It was filled with half-truths and exaggerations, painting her as a naive dreamer who had thrown away the opportunity of a lifetime. "This is bad," she muttered, setting the paper down. Tina nodded. "Yeah, no kidding. What are you going to do? Deborah didn't have an answer. She felt trapped, caught between her dreams and the harsh reality of the music industry. But she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let Leonard Grayson win. Over the next few days, the media frenzy only grew. Reporters camped outside the diner, waiting for a chance to interview her. Customers came in just to catch a glimpse of the waitress who said no to Leonard Grayson. Deborah tried to stay focused, but it was hard. She felt like she was living in a fishbowl, constantly under scrutiny. Then, one night, as she was closing up the diner, she heard a knock on the door. She turned to see a man standing there, his face hidden in the shadows. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. The man stepped into the light, revealing a familiar face. It was Marcus, an old friend from her music days. "Deborah," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "It's been a long time." She felt a surge of relief. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" He smiled. "I heard about what happened with Leonard Grayson. I came to help." Deborah's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. But she knew the battle was far from over. Leonard Grayson wasn't the type to give up easily, and she had just made herself his next target. The conflict had arrived, and it was only going to get worse. Deborah's heart pounded as she walked toward the piano. The weight of humiliation pressed on her, making each step heavier than the last. She glanced at the keys. Suddenly, they looked unfamiliar, daunting. Could she do this? Did she even have a choice? The days following Leonard Grayson's offer were a whirlwind. Deborah tried to return to her normal routine, but the world had other plans. The media frenzy outside the diner grew louder, more invasive. Reporters shouted questions at her every time she stepped outside, and strangers stopped her on the street, asking for selfies or autographs. It was surreal, overwhelming, and utterly exhausting. But the real struggle was internal. Deborah couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. What if Leonard's offer had been her only shot? What if she had thrown away her last chance to make something of herself? The doubts gnawed at her, keeping her up at night and haunting her during the day. Marcus's arrival had been a lifeline. He had been her closest friend during her music days, the one person who had always believed in her. Seeing him again brought back a flood of memories, late-night jam sessions, shared dreams, and the unshakable bond they had formed. "You did the right thing, Deborah," Marcus said as they sat in the diner after hours. "Leonard Grayson is a shark. He would have eaten you alive." She sighed, stirring her coffee absently. "I know, but what now? I can't just go back to being a waitress. Not after this." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Then don't. You've got talent, Deborah. Real talent. You don't need Leonard Grayson to make it. You just need the right opportunity." "And where am I supposed to find that?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. He smiled. "Leave that to me." Over the next few days, Marcus worked tirelessly to help Deborah get back on her feet. He reached out to old contacts, set up meetings, and even helped her record a few demo tracks. It felt good to be making music again, to be working toward something. But the shadow of Leonard Grayson loomed large. One evening, as Deborah was leaving the diner, she noticed a black car parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and she couldn't see inside, but she had a sinking feeling that she was being watched. She quickened her pace, her heart racing, and didn't look back. The next day, the car was there again. This time, it followed her home. Deborah's anxiety grew with each passing day. She started looking over her shoulder, jumping at every sound, and sleeping with the lights on. She felt like she was being hunted, and she didn't know how to fight back. Marcus tried to reassure her. "It's probably nothing," he said. "Just some paparazzi looking for a story." But Deborah wasn't convinced. She had seen the look in Leonard Grayson's eyes when she turned him down. He wasn't the type to let something go. Her fears were confirmed when she received a package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box, and inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short and to the point. "You'll regret this." Deborah's hands trembled as she read the words. She showed the note to Marcus, who immediately called the police. But without any evidence, there was little they could do. The harassment didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Deborah received more threatening messages, Her apartment was vandalized, and she was followed wherever she went. The stress was taking its toll, and she could feel herself unraveling. But she refused to give up. With Marcus's help, Deborah began to fight back. She started by recording a video message, addressing the rumors, and setting the record straight. She posted it online, and within hours, it went viral. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the world reached out to offer their support, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. For the first time in weeks, Deborah felt a glimmer of hope. But Leonard Grayson wasn't done. One night, as Deborah was leaving a late-night recording session, she was approached by a man in a suit. He handed her an envelope and walked away without a word. Inside was an invitation to a private event hosted by Leonard Grayson himself. The note read, "You have one last chance. Don't waste it." Deborah showed the invitation to Marcus, who immediately advised her not to go. "It's a trap," he said. "He's trying to lure you in." But Deborah wasn't so sure. She had spent weeks running, hiding, and fighting. Maybe it was time to face Leonard Grayson head-on. The night of the event, Deborah arrived at the venue, a lavish mansion on the outskirts of the city. She was greeted by a sea of faces, all of them watching her with curiosity and disdain. Leonard Grayson stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne in his hand. He smiled as she approached, his eyes cold and calculating. "I knew you'd come," he said. Deborah took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I'm not here to sign your contract." He raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here?" She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'm here to show you that I don't need you. I never did." The room fell silent as Deborah walked to the grand piano in the corner. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of everything pressing down on her. But then she began to play. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and filled with raw emotion. It was a song she had written during her darkest days, a song about struggle, resilience, and hope. As she played, the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the music. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then slowly, the room erupted into applause. Leonard Grayson's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. He stepped forward, his voice low. "You're better than I thought." Deborah stood up, her eyes blazing. "And you're worse than I imagined." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Leonard Grayson and his world behind. But the struggle wasn't over. As Deborah stepped outside, she was met by a crowd of reporters, their cameras flashing and questions flying. She took a deep breath, her heart still racing from the encounter. "Deborah, over here!" one of the reporters shouted. "What's next for you?" She smiled, a sense of calm washing over her. This is just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. She closed her eyes and let the first note play. A single note, soft, uncertain. Then another, and another, until the melody filled the air. No longer fragile, no longer hesitant. It was her story, and for the first time, the room listened. The night of Leonard Grayson's event was a turning point. Deborah had faced him head-on, played her heart out, and walked away with her head held high. But as she left the mansion, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. What now? The media frenzy outside the venue was overwhelming. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the crowd pressed in around her. Deborah felt like she was drowning, the weight of their expectations crushing her. Marcus was waiting for her at the edge of the crowd. He pushed his way through, grabbed her hand, and led her to a waiting car. They drove in silence, the city lights blurring past the windows. "You did it," Marcus said finally, his voice filled with awe. "You stood up to him." Deborah nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She had stood up to Leonard Grayson, but at what cost? The threats, the harassment, the constant fear. It had all taken its toll. She felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. When they arrived at her apartment, Deborah was surprised to find a package waiting for her. It was a small, unmarked box, just like the one she had received before. Her heart sank as she opened it, half expecting another threatening note. But this time it was different. Inside the box was a single sheet of paper, but the message wasn't from Leonard Grayson. It was from a music producer, someone she had worked with years ago. The note was short and to the point. "I heard what happened. Let's talk." Deborah stared at the note, her mind racing. Could this be her chance? Marcus read the note over his shoulder and smiled. "This is it, Deborah. This is your opportunity." But Deborah wasn't so sure. She had been burned before, and the scars were still fresh. She didn't know if she could trust anyone in the industry, not after everything she had been through. The next few days were a blur. Deborah met with the producer, an old friend named Sarah, who had heard about her performance at Leonard Grayson's event. Sarah offered her a deal, a chance to record an album, to tell her story in her own words. It was everything Deborah had ever wanted, but it came with a catch. Sarah wanted her to sign an exclusive contract, one that would give her control over Deborah's career. Deborah hesitated. She had been down this road before, and it had ended in disaster. But Sarah was different. She had always been honest, always had Deborah's best interests at heart. Still, the decision weighed heavily on her. Deborah spent the next few days agonizing over the offer. She talked to Marcus, to Sarah, to anyone who would listen. But in the end, the decision was hers alone. One night, as she sat at the piano in the diner, the answer came to her. She didn't need a contract, a manager, or a producer. She didn't need anyone to tell her what to do. She had the talent, the drive, and the determination to make it on her own. The next morning, Deborah called Sarah and declined the offer. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "This could be your only shot." Deborah smiled. "I'm sure. I'm going to do this my way." With that, she hung up the phone and got to work. Deborah began recording her album in her apartment, using whatever equipment she could find. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She wrote songs about her struggles, her dreams, and her journey. Each note, each word, was a piece of her soul. As the album took shape, Deborah began to share snippets online. The response was overwhelming. People connected with her story, her music, and her authenticity. But Leonard Grayson wasn't done. One evening, as Deborah was finishing a recording session, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Deborah," a familiar voice said. It was Leonard Grayson. Her heart raced. "What do you want?" "I want to make you a star," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You've proven yourself. Now let me help you." Deborah's mind raced. She had worked so hard to get to this point, to do things her way. But Leonard's offer was tempting. He had the connections, the resources, and the power to take her career to the next level. But at what cost? She took a deep breath, her decision clear. "No," she said firmly. "I don't need your help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Leonard chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You'll regret this, Deborah. Mark my words." The line went dead, and Deborah was left standing there, her heart pounding. But she didn't regret her decision. She knew she had made the right choice. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Deborah finished her album and released it independently. The response was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her music resonated with people, and her story inspired them. But the climax was yet to come. One night, as Deborah was performing at a small venue, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Leonard Grayson. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. She continued to play, pouring her heart into every note. When the performance ended, the crowd erupted into applause. Deborah took a bow, her eyes scanning the room. Leonard Grayson was gone, but he had left something behind, a single rose on the stage, with a note attached. Deborah picked it up, her hands trembling. The note read, "You've won. For now." She smiled, a sense of triumph washing over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Leonard Grayson, and come out on top. But she knew the battle wasn't over. Leonard Grayson wasn't the type to give up easily, and she had just made herself his next target. As she left the stage, Deborah felt a sense of calm. She had made her decision, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The climax had passed, but the story was far from over. Leonard sat frozen, his smirk long gone. The applause erupted around him, but he barely heard it. Deborah stood, facing him one last time. "I guess talent speaks for itself," she said softly, walking away. And for the first time, he had nothing to say. The weeks following Deborah's independent album release were a whirlwind. Her music resonated with people in a way she had never imagined. Songs about her struggles, her dreams, and her resilience struck a chord with listeners from all walks of life. She wasn't just a singer anymore. She was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of perseverance. But the road to success wasn't without its challenges. Leonard Grayson's shadow loomed large, and Deborah knew he wasn't done with her. She had turned him down, humiliated him in front of his peers, and proven that she didn't need him to succeed. For a man like Leonard, that was unforgivable. Deborah's first major performance after the album release was at a prestigious music festival. It was a turning point, a chance to prove herself on a bigger stage. The venue was packed, the energy electric. As she stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the piano keys. The first note was soft, tentative, but as the melody grew, so did her confidence. She poured her heart into every word, every note, telling her story through her music. The audience was captivated. By the time she finished, the applause was deafening. Deborah stood, her eyes scanning the crowd. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. But the moment was short-lived. As she left the stage, she was approached by a man in a suit. He handed her an envelope and walked away without a word. Inside was a letter from Leonard Grayson. "Congratulations," it read. "You've proven yourself. But remember, the music industry is a small world. We'll meet again." Deborah's heart sank. She had hoped that Leonard would leave her alone, but it was clear that he wasn't going to let her go so easily. The next few months were a mix of triumph and tension. Deborah's career continued to soar, but the constant threat of Leonard's interference weighed heavily on her. She received anonymous messages, her performances were sabotaged, and rumors about her began to circulate. But Deborah refused to back down. With the support of Marcus and her growing fan base, she fought back. She addressed the rumors head-on, sharing her story with honesty and vulnerability. Her fans rallied behind her, their support unwavering. One night, after a particularly grueling performance, Deborah received a call from Sarah, the producer who had offered her a deal months ago. "Deborah," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. "I need to see you. It's important." They met at a quiet cafe, the tension palpable. Sarah handed Deborah a folder filled with documents. "What's this?" Deborah asked, her heart racing. "Proof," Sarah said. "Proof that Leonard Grayson has been behind everything. The threats, the sabotage, the rumors, it's all him." Deborah's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. There were emails, bank statements, and even recordings of Leonard discussing his plans to ruin her career. "Why are you giving this to me?" Deborah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah sighed. "Because it's the right thing to do. Leonard Grayson is a predator, and he needs to be stopped. You have the power to do that." Deborah felt a surge of determination. She had spent months running, hiding, and fighting. Now, it was time to take a stand. The next day, Deborah held a press conference. She stood in front of a room full of reporters, her voice steady and strong. "I'm here today to share the truth," she began. "For months, I've been the target of harassment, sabotage, and lies. But I'm not here to play the victim. I'm here to fight back." She held up the folder Sarah had given her. "This is proof that Leonard Grayson has been behind everything. He tried to control me, to silence me, but he failed. And now, it's time for him to face the consequences." The room erupted into chaos as reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. Deborah stood her ground, her resolve unshakable. The fallout was immediate. Leonard Grayson's empire began to crumble as the evidence against him came to light. His reputation was ruined, his career in shambles. But for Deborah, the victory was bittersweet. She had won the battle, but the war had taken its toll. In the weeks that followed, Deborah took a step back from the spotlight. She needed time to heal, to process everything that had happened. She spent her days writing music, reconnecting with her roots, and finding peace in the simple things. One evening, as she sat at the piano in the diner, Marcus walked in. He sat down beside her, a smile on his face. "You did it," he said. "You beat him." Deborah shook her head. "I didn't beat him, Marcus. I just refused to let him beat me." Marcus smiled. "Same thing." They sat in silence for a moment, the soft hum of the piano filling the air. "What's next?" Marcus asked. Deborah smiled, a sense of calm washing over her. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." As she played the first note, Deborah felt a sense of peace. She had faced her fears, stood up to Leonard Grayson, and come out on top. But more importantly, she had found herself. The final impact of her journey wasn't just about music or fame. It was about resilience, about the power of standing up for what you believe in. And as the melody filled the room, Deborah knew that her story was just beginning.